Chapter 4. Sunday morning at church, Tom introduced Julia to the head of the school board, Timothy Hansen. When he saw her, he was confused. "But you sent a telegram saying you'd be 2 weeks late." Julia shook her head. "No, I didn't." "When did I send that?" He thought he'd received a telegram from her? No wonder Tom had been the only one waiting for her. He dug into his pocket. "See? Right here." He handed her the telegram. I will be arriving 2 weeks later than scheduled. Stop. I hope you will forgive me for making everyone wait. Stop. Miss Simmons. Stop." Julia almost laughed before handing the telegram to Tom. She'll be here in 2 weeks apparently. She hoped that Tom would still want to remain married to her after Anna arrived. Tom read it and shook his head. "This is ridiculous. If I'd actually gotten this telegram, I wouldn't have pushed you into marrying me." He couldn't believe that the telegram had been misplaced that way. Mr. Hansen looked between the two of them. "So you married Thomas instead of waiting for me?" His face was incredulous. Julia blushed, shaking her head. Honestly, it was all very confusing. You see, Tom sent for a mail-order bride, and she was supposed to arrive on the same stage as me. Her name was Anna Simmons. I'm Julia Simmons, and when Tom saw me, he asked if I was Miss Simmons, so he assumed I was here to marry him when I said yes. He was the only person waiting for me, so I thought he was from the school board." She knew that didn't make much sense, but she wasn't going to explain that Tom's kisses made her lose her senses. That would make her look like someone she didn't want to be. Mr. Hansen frowned. "I'm still not sure how that would have led to a marriage, but I can see that it did. You'll have to resign, of course." Julia shook her head. "But why? I can be a wife and a teacher at the same time." She hoped he would listen to reason. She'd worked too hard to become a teacher to have her plans thwarted now. "It just isn't done. I suppose I can let you stay on until a new teacher is found, and it will be nice not having to postpone the start of school like we thought, but really, we couldn't let you teach the whole year. We'll find someone to take your place." Mr. Hansen turned and walked away, and Julia knew better than to argue. There had been a definite air of finality to his words. She looked at Tom, her eyes sad. "I guess you won't have to put up with a working wife for an entire year, after all." She walked over to sit in the pew he'd pointed out as the one he usually sat in and folded her hands in her lap, no longer interested in meeting a lot of new people. She blinked rapidly, doing her best to hold back the tears. What a way to meet new people. Tom moved beside her and awkwardly patted her hand. "It'll work out. You'll see." He didn't know how it would work out, but he was determined to make it happen. Several of the children heard she was to be their new teacher and rushed across the room to gawk at her. Only one was bold enough to actually introduce herself, an older girl named Beatrice. "You're the new teacher?" she asked, sitting down beside Julia. Julia nodded. "I'll be teaching you at least for a short time." She tried to smile, but it felt forced, even to her. "I love school. My favorite subject is reading, but I like arithmetic and geography almost as much. I just finished reading Heidi." "Have you read it?" Julia's eyes lit up. "I borrowed it from my teacher 2 years ago. It was a wonderful story." "What other books have you read?" Tom grinned, knowing his new wife would be content as she talked to her student for a while. He walked over to Mr. Hansen, talking to him in low tones. "It means a lot to Julia to be able to teach at the school. I don't much want her to do it, but I'd appreciate it if you'd let her at least finish out the year there. Let her work until Christmas, and if she's not doing her job well enough, then find someone else then." Mr. Hansen shook his head. "It clearly states in her contract that she can't be married. We can't have a married schoolteacher. If it were a man maybe, but not a lady. It's just not right." Tom scratched his head. I don't see why not. It doesn't make sense to me that you would penalize her for being married. Wouldn't that make her more settled to not be thinking about marrying every eligible man in town? I'm sorry, Tom. We're not going to see eye to eye on this. Finding another teacher will be my first priority. Mr. Hanson turned his back on Tom and strode from the building. He made it clear he wasn't interested in anything else Tom had to say on the matter. When Tom walked back to the pew he'd shared with Julia, he found her still talking to the girl beside her about books they'd both read. He laughed softly. She would inspire children to read whether she was formally teaching them or not. He'd make sure to tell her that on their way home that afternoon. As they drove toward the ranch, Tom took her hand in his. I know you wanted to teach, but I'm not sorry that you're my wife. He looked at her out of the corner of his eye as he watched the road. He didn't want her to regret their marriage. Julia made a face, but nodded. I just wish I could be married to you and teach. She knew she didn't regret their marriage either. Every day her feelings for him were a little bit stronger, and she looked forward to the time when she could be a full-time wife. She would have preferred that time to only happen during the summers, but she knew that wasn't a possibility any longer. Resting her head on his shoulder, she knew that even though her life was much different than she'd pictured it as she took the train west, she would be happy if she could spend every night in Tom's arms. Tom was pleased with her answer, but still worried that she wasn't entirely happy. He knew she'd studied hard to get her teacher's certificate, and he hated that he was keeping her from being able to use it. If he'd given her time to explain, maybe he could have courted her and ended up married anyway. He didn't think Anna was ever going to show up, and even if she did, he knew there was no way he could prefer her to his sweet Julia. Asterisk. Julia was nervous Monday morning as she prepared for her first day as a teacher. She had her lunch in a pail, and she had made a large pot of soup, leaving it in the oven to keep it hot while she was at work. Tom could have some for lunch if he wanted, and she would have very little to do to prepare it for their supper once they got home. Not yet knowing how tired she would be after her first day of teaching, she thought that was for the best. Would you mind hitching up the buggy for me so I can drive myself to school? She asked after she'd washed the breakfast dishes. I don't think I could handle the wagon. He'd offered before, so she was certain he'd just do it when she asked. Tom looked at her over his coffee cup and finally shook his head. At least for today, I'm going to drive you into town and pick you up. I don't know what else to do. She frowned. I'm sure I could handle the buggy just fine. She didn't want him to think that she needed to be totally dependent on him. He shrugged. I'll just feel better if I know you got there safely. It may be crazy, but I'd appreciate it greatly if you'd just let me drive you. He didn't know what he was worried about, except that she would go to school and never come home. He needed to be a part of all of her life, even her teaching. That's fine. You can drive me. She didn't want to argue with him about it, but she really would have preferred showing up for her first day on the job alone. Would the children think she was afraid if he drove her? She picked up her lunch pail and carried it out to the wagon which he had hitched and waiting for her. He helped her up, and she tucked the lap robe around her, not wanting to mess up her skirt. She wanted to look her best for her first day of school with the new children. She'd met several of them at church on Sunday, but she was nervous about the others, of course. The drive to the schoolhouse took more time than she would like, and she found herself pushing her feet against the front of the wagon, as if it would get them there faster. Once she realized what she was doing, she let out a low laugh. Tom looked at her with surprise. What's so funny? She'd seemed nervous until she'd laughed, so he had no idea what was going on in her mind. Julia grinned and nodded at her feet. I'm so excited about my first day teaching that I'm actually pushing my feet against the front of the wagon like it will get us there faster. He laughed softly, his arm going around her shoulders. I'm glad you are happy to be going. I know it took them a while to find you to teach. You may be able to teach here for a few months before they can replace you. As much as he wanted her home full-time, he wanted her to be happy, and her feelings were more important to him than his own. Julia smiled, resting her head against his shoulder, before realizing she could muss up her hair. She sat up straight and felt the sides to make sure none of her hair had fallen from her bun. I would really like that. I know you want a full-time wife, though. He shrugged. It was my mistake that led you to change your life for me. I know that you'd like to teach for as long as you can. I won't begrudge you the time with the children. She looked at him and smiled. He was truly a good man, and she couldn't be unhappy that she was fortunate enough to have married him. I appreciate you saying that. It makes me feel so much better about it. I don't want you to be unhappy because you don't get to do what you dreamed of doing. I hope you enjoy teaching as much as you think you will. Thank you. I hope so, too. She held her books and lunch pail in her lap as he pulled up in front of the school. She waited until he walked around to her side of the wagon and helped her down. They'd arrived a good half hour before school was to start, and she was thankful for that. He went into the schoolhouse with her, planning to chase away any critters that had taken up residence there over the summer. When he saw how clean it was, he was surprised. Someone came and cleaned up for you, I see. She nodded, walking to the teacher's desk and running her hand across it. She walked to the windows and opened them all one by one. They would need the breeze if the children were going to try to pay attention at all. September in Texas was a lot hotter than September in New York. She sat down at her desk and looked in the drawers. Someone had slipped pencils and paper into the drawers, and she was very thankful. She had everything she needed to start her day. Do you need me to do anything for you before I leave? He asked. He didn't want to leave her in town, but he knew this was where she needed to be. She shook her head. I'll be fine. I guess I'll see you at 4. I'll be here. He walked to the door and turned back to look at her sitting at the teacher's desk with a huge smile lighting up her face, and he felt more than a little guilty. She was where she wanted to be. He wished he hadn't messed up her plans so badly. Julia looked at the small clock on her desk and realized it hadn't been wound. She carefully set the time and wound the clock, setting it to the time on the watch pinned to her breast. She noted that she only had 5 minutes before it would be time to call the children in. There was a small bell on her desk that she would use to let the children know it was time for classes to start. Her palms were sweaty as she thought of the day ahead. She would have to mainly learn about her students the first day, and she was looking forward to it, but nervous at the same time. They would start the in-depth learning the following day. She went to the door and rang the bell, noting that the schoolyard was sparse. There were small boys and girls of all ages. As Beatrice walked past her toward her desk, Julia stopped her. Where are the bigger boys? She asked. Oh, they'll be coming later in the year. They need to help with roundup and getting the crops in. Most of them are only here from mid-October through March. Beatrice hurried to her desk and took her seat, sitting with a girl around her age whom Julia hadn't met yet. Julia walked to her desk and picked up a notebook, turning it to the first page. I need to get everyone's names and ages, please. If you know where you are in your readers, please let me know. I'll walk around the room and talk to each of you individually. You may whisper quietly while I do this. If anyone gets out of hand, I will take away the privilege of whispering. She wanted to be nice, but firm with the children, letting them know they wouldn't get away with a lot of shenanigans in her classroom. She walked around the room and took the names of all the students. There were only 14 of them, but there was room for 6 more. How many older boys are part of your class? She asked. And Hayes, one of the girls in the back row, raised her hand. There are just 4. Do they do any studies when they're not in school? Julia asked. She hated that the older boys were in school for such a short period every year, but she knew it was the way things were done in most places. And shook her head. No, ma'am. Most boys around here will be farmers or ranchers anyway. There's no reason for them to go to school when they can learn their trades at home. And was a tall thin girl with blonde hair and blue eyes. She was about 15 and wore her hair in a bun atop her head. Julia nodded, not wanting to argue with the common thoughts about educating boys. She knew she wouldn't win anyway. I see you're already sitting divided into classes. I'll write the assignments on the board for you to study for everyone but the first reader group, and I'll work with them at my desk. Everyone else, please work quietly. She found she was much less nervous than she expected to be now that the time was at hand for her to actually teach. The students sat before her with their hands folded, and they began work immediately. Someone had trained them very well to pay attention and do what they were told during class. The day progressed very well for Julia. The children were well behaved, and the day moved quickly. At lunchtime, several of the older girls asked if they may stay inside so they could work on the knitting and crocheting they'd brought with them. Julia granted them permission and watched them as she ate her lunch, wishing she was allowed to sit with them. She was only 18, and at least 2 of her students were within a year or 2 of her age. She couldn't become too friendly with them, though, because she couldn't risk forming a close friendship with a student and losing her authority. At the end of the day, as she watched her students leave, Julia felt slightly let down. She'd loved the work, but she had hoped she would change the world of at least one of her students. She knew that this group had been trained well by former teachers, and none of them really needed their world changed. She dismissed the students at 4 and quickly swept the classroom, making certain everything was clean and ready for the next day. She had just finished up and was closing the windows when she spotted Tom driving up. She took her bonnet from the hook behind her desk and carefully tied it under her chin. It wouldn't be good for her to seem unkempt around town while she was the schoolteacher. Chapter 5. How's the teacher today? Tom asked after helping her into the wagon. As much as he hated that she was away all day, he was proud of her for what she did. She sighed. It was a good day. I'm exhausted, but I think everything went well. All the students were very well behaved. You sound like that's a bad thing. He looked at her questioningly as he sat down and took the reins. Did something bad happen? Julia shook her head. Nothing bad happened at all. She knew her voice sounded disappointed, but she wasn't sure how to stop it from sounding that way. And that makes you sad? I was hoping that my first day would be going into class and finding out that all of my students desperately needed me to change their lives. I wanted one of them to have trouble learning or have trouble at home where they needed me. Instead, I have a classroom full of well-behaved students who are right where they should be educationally. The only real problem is that the older boys aren't there, but that's nothing unusual. It wasn't like that in my school, but it's normal in rural areas from what I understand. He laughed softly. You realize you're upset because there were no problems, right? She shrugged. I wanted to change the world with my teaching, or if not the entire world, at least one child's world. He squeezed her hand. I'm sorry it wasn't what you expected it to be. It's all right. I won't be doing it for very long anyway. At least I was able to do some teaching. She hated to admit that she was disappointed in her day, but she really was. She didn't know why she wanted to have troubled students, but that's what she'd always imagined she'd be facing. Now she would just have to get used to the fact that she wouldn't have her well-behaved students for long. Asterisk. When Julia left the school on the Friday of her second week as a teacher, she drove the buggy past the stagecoach. As the stage pulled away, there was a young woman standing looking around bewilderedly, obviously searching for something. She could see the other woman had tears in her eyes, so she pulled over and asked, "Are you here to meet someone?" The girl nodded. "I'm here to meet my fiancé, Tom Harding. He was supposed to be waiting for me." Julia felt her heart fall into her stomach. She knew there was only one thing she could do, so she did it immediately. "Come with me. We'll talk." She waited as the other woman threw her bags into the back of the buggy, and grabbing a handhold, climbed up to join her. "My name is Julia. I'm Anna Simmons." Her voice was soft, and she looked so sweet sitting there beside her, making Julia wish that Tom could have had her for his wife. He deserved someone soft-spoken and sweet, unlike her. "I was Julia Simmons until 2 weeks ago. I'm going to tell you a funny story." At Anna's nod, Julia told the story of her arriving and Tom confirming she was Miss Simmons. She told her how she kept trying to protest, but how Tom had just kissed her every time. "And that's how I ended up married to your fiancé." Anna made a face. "I can certainly understand how that could have happened. I told him I was certain that once I arrived, I would just try to run back home, so he must have just kept kissing you to keep you from running away." She shrugged. "I'm not upset, because he was a stranger to me, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Julia smiled at the other woman. "Well, I think there's only one answer. You go home with me." They had a spare room she could put her in, and Anna could decide what to do from there. They could use her first month's wages to send her back to Massachusetts if they needed to. "So what's Tom like?" Anna asked, her face devoid of expression. Julia grinned. "He's a wonderful husband to me. I honestly couldn't ask for a better man. I'm still teaching until another teacher can be found, and he's been very supportive of me throughout it all." She didn't add that she was certain she would lose him to Anna. She didn't want anyone to know how insecure he was, but if he could fall in love with her as soon as he saw her just thinking she was Anna, how would he feel when he saw the real woman? "Will he mind that you're bringing me home with you?" Anna looked nervous at the idea. Julia shook her head. "No, of course not. He'll understand that he's the one who stranded you by marrying me, so it's our responsibility to help you. We have a spare room that you can use until you decide what you want to do." It would be strange having the other woman living in their house, even for a short period, but she didn't feel like she could do anything else. Anna bit her lip. "I guess I really have nowhere to go, do I? We would buy you a ticket back home if you need us to, or there are plenty of unmarried men around. You could stay with us until you found one you were interested in marrying. Or you don't happen to be a certified teacher, do you?" She knew it was a long shot, but it would be great if they could just switch roles. She'd married Anna's fiancé, so maybe Anna could teach in her place. Anna looked at her in surprise. "I was a teacher before I left home." "Why? Does this town need a teacher now?" Julia looked at Anna with surprise. Hadn't she listened to anything she'd said? "They don't allow married women to teach here, so I'm just working until they find someone to replace me. If you wanted to teach, you would have a place to stay, because there was a family in town who had agreed to let me board there." She looked at the other woman questioningly, hoping that she was willing to take her place. Anna nodded, obviously thinking about it. "Could you introduce me to the school board at church on Sunday? If you don't mind, that is." "Oh, I don't mind at all. Mr. Hanson will be pleased to have someone interested in the post, because he's very eager to get rid of me." Julia shrugged. "He really has a problem with a married woman teaching, but I'm not certain why. I've never really understood why a married woman can't be as good of a teacher as an unmarried woman. I'd think a married woman would be more focused on the students and not thinking nearly as much about who she's going to marry. I'm not certain I understand the reasoning either, but I do know it's a rule in most places." Anna looked out the window. "How far is it to the ranch?" "We're almost there." Tom doesn't know you're coming, so be prepared for him to be surprised. He never got your telegram, you know. It went to Mr. Hanson, because you just used initials, and Tom and Mr. Hanson have the same initials. She grinned as she mentioned the mix-up. She knew she shouldn't find it amusing, but if it hadn't happened, she never would have married Tom. I guess I did everything wrong, didn't I? If I'd gotten on that train the day I was supposed to instead of being too afraid to leave town, none of this ever would have happened. Oh, is that why you were late? Julia parked in front of the ranch house and carefully stepped down. She picked up her books and lunch pail to carry inside. If you want to leave your bags, Tom will happily take them in for you when he unhitches the horse. She patted the horse's neck as she walked toward the house. Julia hurried inside and immediately went to the kitchen. She hadn't yet started supper, and now she had 3 mouths to feed instead of 2. When she turned, she saw that Anna had donned her apron and had set her bags on the floor beside the table. Julia smiled. You don't have to help with supper. Your room is at the top of the stairs. Go ahead and get comfortable. She didn't want their guest to have to help cook. Oh, I love to cook, Anna protested. What are you fixing? Julia shrugged. I think I'm just going to make stew with some salt pork, and maybe some biscuits to go with it. It was what she cooked when she didn't have much time. Tom never complained, though. I'll make the biscuits, Anna offered. As Julia worked, she kept half an eye on the other woman, immediately feeling inadequate. She had to measure out everything that she put into biscuits, while Anna was just taking a handful of one thing and throwing in a little bit of something else. How had she become such a good cook? Did you cook a lot for your family? Anna shook her head. I was an orphan, raised in the orphanage in Beckham, Massachusetts. I helped in the kitchen there a great deal. When I was too old to stay any longer, I became a teacher, but I really didn't enjoy it, so I decided to become a mail-order bride. She looked down at her hands, which were covered with flour. I should have fulfilled my obligations and just come instead of deciding to wait longer. Julia frowned. Honestly? I'm glad you waited. I never would have married Tom if you hadn't, and I'm very happy with him. She knew she must sound like she was bragging that she was the one who had married Tom, but she didn't mean to. She was simply happy with her marriage and needed to show it. Tom opened the door then and stopped short. He walked to Julia and pressed a kiss to her cheek, giving her a confused glance. Tom, this is Anna Simmons. I found her standing in the street as the stagecoach drove off. Didn't you send her a telegram? Julia's eyes met Tom's as she asked him the question, hoping he would not look at Anna and know she was the perfect woman for him. Tom shook his head. I'm so sorry. I plumb forgot about it. I should have sent it 2 weeks ago. Anna smiled, her eyes not meeting his. It's all right. I understand that mistakes happen. Tom frowned. She wouldn't even look at him. She was a pretty girl, but she was nothing compared to his Julia. Julia had flame red hair that made her stand out in a crowd, while Anna's was blonde. He'd done much better than the little mousy girl that looked to be afraid of her own shadow. Where are you going to stay while you're in town? He asked. Anna looked at Julia, her eyes begging the other woman to answer for her. Julia smiled at Anna kindly. She's going to stay with us until she decides what she's going to do. She's trying to decide if she wants to find a husband here, stay in town to teach, or head back to Massachusetts. I told her if she wants to go home that we'll pay for the ticket. She didn't add that she was going to introduce Anna to the school board on Sunday. He'd see that for himself soon enough, and she didn't want to get his hopes up. Tom wanted to argue that it wasn't his responsibility to pay for her ticket back to Massachusetts, but he really felt as if it was. He shouldn't have married Julia after she had told him her name, but he had given her no choice. He'd ruined the lives of both women by not listening, but he would do everything he could to make up for it. Anna sat next to Julia at the table, and she was just as shy as she had stated in her letters. She whispered any time she needed anything. It took about 5 minutes for Tom to become annoyed. He never would have made it a month without being frustrated with her. Julia kept up a steady stream of chatter, talking about all her students and how the first 2 weeks of school had gone. She mentioned that she was more than a little disillusioned with teaching, and Anna nodded. "That's how I felt after my first year teaching," she whispered. "I really thought I'd have an opportunity to make a difference, but I never did." Tom eyed Anna. "You were a teacher? You didn't tell me that in your letter." Anna blushed, obviously hating being the object of his attention. "I'm sure there are a lot of things you don't know about me." She took a bite of her stew, not meeting his eyes. Tom looked at Julia and frowned. He wondered how long Anna would be staying with them, hoping it wouldn't be long. He wasn't certain how long he could take the constant shyness. After the meal, Tom sat at the table and watched as the two women worked together. They were obviously becoming friends, and while that was fine with him, it still felt awkward. Of course, Julia knew very few people in the area, so he was pleased she'd found a friend. Julia sat beside him after finishing the dishes and picked up her crocheting. She was working on a shawl to wear for winter, because she said her coat from the previous year had worn out. She'd hoped not to need a coat in Texas at all, but he'd explained that in the area they were in there were 1 or 2 days per year below freezing. It would be much better than being in New York City, though, so she wouldn't complain. Anna hesitated for a moment, looking between them. Julia smiled at her. "You can stay down here and join us, or you're welcome to go upstairs. I told you where your room is, but there's a bathroom right beside it. With a real porcelain bathtub." Julia was certain Anna was like her, and had never even seen a real bathtub, let alone used one. She loved the idea of letting her friend use it, as long as she didn't think she should stay there forever and marry her former fiancé. Anna had given no indication she would even think of doing such a thing, but Julia was more than a little nervous. She was afraid of Tom's feelings for Anna more than anything. Anna's eyes widened. "Would it be all right if I used it?" she asked. Julia nodded. "Of course. Make yourself at home here. Please. We're happy to share anything we have." Julia was more than willing to share with the girl, who should have been the mistress of the house, not her. Her feelings were very mixed about Anna. She felt like she should be kind to her and give her everything she owned, because she'd stolen her husband, no matter how inadvertently it had been. Anna walked toward the stairs, stopping to pick up her bags on the way. She hadn't yet gone up to see her room, because she'd decided to help Julia with dinner instead. Julia and Tom both watched her until she was out of sight before turning to one another. As soon as she was out of sight, Tom turned to Julia. "How long is she staying here?" he asked. Julia frowned. She knew he was comparing the two of them, and she was certain she was falling short. Anna was as petite as she was tall, and she had the prettiest blonde hair Julia had ever seen. She was the kind of girl who Julia had always felt slightly envious of, and it made her feel uncomfortable. "I'm not certain. She's trying to decide whether she's going to go back to Massachusetts, or try to find someone else looking for a bride here. I'm sure there are plenty of men looking for wives." She watched her husband's face, hoping he wouldn't show any sign of being attracted to the pretty blonde. Tom nodded. "Would you like me to ask around? See if I can find someone she might be interested in marrying?" The sooner he got the woman out of his house and he could go back to being a newlywed, the better, as far as Tom was concerned. "We'll introduce her around at church on Sunday. She doesn't really have anyone to go home to, so I hope she stays. Besides, I kind of like her. I think the two of us will be good friends. If she doesn't try to steal my husband from me." As soon as the thought crossed her mind, Julia felt guilty for it. She was the one who had stolen the other girl's husband, not the other way around. Anna had been very sweet about it as well, not even raising her voice to Julia. She had to be frightened because she had nowhere to go and knew no one in the state, but she was still pleasant to be around. Tom sighed. I'll introduce her to my friends. Maybe one of them was thinking of sending off for a mail-order bride. He shook his head. A month ago, he'd been excited because he had a bride on the way. Now he had 2 women living with him, and he really needed to get rid of one of them. The one upstairs, of course. Not his beautiful sweet Julia. How had he ended up in this situation? Chapter 6. Julia and Anna spent the day cleaning the house on Saturday, and they talked while they worked. While Julia scrubbed the floors, Anna washed the breakfast dishes. I'm sorry that the house was so dirty when you came. I can't seem to keep up with all the cooking, cleaning, and teaching. Something is going to have to give. Maybe that's why teachers aren't allowed to be married. It's just too much work. She sighed as she thought about all the work that needed to be done, including the entire week's worth of washing. She'd do her baking as well, but she'd have to bake more bread before school a couple of days that week. She hadn't really thought about how she was working 2 full-time jobs until she started doing it. Anna grinned at her over her shoulder. You may have a point. I can't imagine even trying to do that much. Why didn't you just resign your position as soon as you married Tom? Julia thought about the best way to answer that for a minute. There were a couple of reasons. First of all, I'd agreed to teach for the entire school year, and I believe very strongly in following through on my obligations. Second, teaching has been my parents' dream for me since I was a little girl. They have always worked in factories, and all my friends were leaving school by 14 to work in the factories there in New York City as well. My parents sacrificed to keep me in school so I could be a teacher. I hate letting them down. And she wouldn't if she could help it. She'd teach for every minute the school board would allow her to teach, whether she liked it or not. So, if you didn't want to let them down, why did you marry Tom? Julia blushed, not certain what to say to that. Finally, she decided to tell the other woman the truth. When I first saw Tom walking across the street toward me, all I could think about was how handsome he was, and then when he asked if I was Miss Simmons, and I said I was, he kissed me. My brain turned to mush. I tried to explain everything, but he thought I was you and just being shy, so every time I started to talk about how he had mistaken me for someone else, he'd kiss me again. And my brain would turn to mush again. I finally just went along with it all, because I couldn't think straight. She looked off across the room for a moment before she got back to scrubbing the floor. Tom is a really persuasive kisser. She couldn't believe she'd actually admitted that to the other woman, but it was the truth. His kisses turned her into something she wasn't most of the time, and even after 2 weeks of marriage it was still the same. He'd kiss her, and her brain would be mush. Anna stared at Julia in surprise for a moment. Oh, that would have scared me. I wouldn't have liked it at all. I probably would have gotten back on the stage so fast, he wouldn't have known what happened. Julie grinned. It certainly worked on me. I've had boys try to kiss me before, but I always hated it. With Tom? I didn't ever want him to stop. She knew it wasn't the kind of thing she was supposed to talk to an unmarried woman about, but she needed her to understand why she'd married a stranger. It was really an odd thing to have done. Oh, I don't think that will ever happen for me. Anna sighed. I want to marry, but I'm so timid around men. I can see now it never would have worked for Tom and me. He's so forceful. It would have scared me a great deal. Julia shook her head. We'll find you a good man. There are so many more men than women here in Texas. I'm sure you'll have your pick of men who are just perfect for you. She didn't know many men there yet, but she'd do her research and find just the right one for Anna. She wanted her to stay, but she wanted her to be married, so Tom wouldn't be tempted by her. You're kind to say that. I don't know if that's what I want after all, though. Tom seemed so wonderful in his letters, and then I met him, and I'm instantly almost paralyzed with nerves. No, I don't think getting married is the right thing for me right now. Julia immediately wanted to help her new friend change her mind, but she had no idea how to do it. She didn't want her to leave the area, though, because she was the first friend she'd made since arriving in the state. She said nothing else about it as she finished scrubbing the floors, but her mind was constantly working on how she could get the other woman married off and happy. Julia introduced Anna around at church the following day. She hadn't met many people yet, but she at least knew Mr. Hanson, the head of the school board. He was the man Julia had agreed to board with during her year there, and he very obviously loved the idea of hiring Anna in Julia's place. Julia wanted to poke the man in the eye with a rusty fork for his antiquated ways, but she was glad he took an interest in her friend. So you've taught before? What's your experience? He asked, obviously deciding to interview her right there and just get the whole thing over with. Anna clutched Julia's hand to give her courage, obviously very nervous under the steely gaze of Mr. Hanson. I taught for 2 years at a small rural school outside of Beckham, Massachusetts. I boarded with a local family while I taught there. Mr. Hanson nodded. My wife and I have agreed to board the new teacher, whomever she may be. Our children are out of the house now, but I'm on the school board, and we live just across the street from the schoolhouse. That sounds as if it would work for me. Anna dug into the drawstring purse she had attached to her wrist. I brought my teaching credentials in case you needed to see them. Mr. Hanson looked over the paper. This seems to be in order. Yes, absolutely. I'll talk to the others, but I believe we'll be offering you a job. Where are you staying? I'm staying with Julia and Tom Harding. I was supposed to marry Tom, Anna said softly. Mr. Hanson glared at Julia. Yes, I've heard what happened there. It's why I'm looking for a new teacher. He shook his head. I hope your morals are stronger than the last teacher we hired. We will offer you $40 a month for teaching, minus $10 a month for room and board. Would that be acceptable should we offer you the position? Anna nodded. That sounds more than fair. Julia shook her head as Mr. Hanson walked off to go speak with the other members of the school board. He makes me so angry. It's like he doesn't have the ability to remember what it's like to meet someone and be attracted to them. She muttered under her breath, angrier than she could ever remember being. How dare he be so bigoted about her? He simply had no right. Anna smiled. Don't listen to him. He's just trying to do his job, even if he's going about it in a very odd way. Julia sighed. Oh, I know. I'm working hard to make certain the children are taught well, even though he makes me angry. I'm honestly looking forward to the day when I can be a full-time wife. Teaching here is not what I imagined teaching would be. She didn't mind the teaching, but she wished there was a way to help the children more than she did. She honestly felt like she was wasting her time when most of them could simply do the work in their books without her. Anna patted Julia's arm. Nothing is ever exactly what you think it will be. I had Tom all built up in my head to be an almost godlike man. I get here, and he's just like every other man I've ever met. Julia laughed. I had never heard of him, but I think he's pretty wonderful. I guess it's all in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? She couldn't imagine a woman seeing Tom for the first time and not simply falling at his feet. He'd had her stomach filled with butterflies before they even met. Mr. Hanson came back then, interrupting their giggles. The school board has voted to offer you the position. You may start tomorrow. Tomorrow? That soon? But is there a problem with that, Miss Simmons? Mr. Hanson raised an eyebrow as if just waiting for her to argue with him. No, sir. Anna looked at Julia, her eyes full of anxiousness. Julia smiled sweetly. We'll get you packed and take you to Mr. Hansen's house this evening, Anna. It's no problem. At least she hoped it wasn't. Tom may have other plans, but he usually kept his Sundays open. It was their only day they spent together every week. Now that she was teaching, their time seemed to be very scarce. I should think not. It's going to be hard enough for those children to have to switch teachers midterm. We'll make the transition as smooth as possible. He looked at Julia. You'll be paid for the half month you worked. Good day. He turned on his heel and left them standing there. Anna's eyes were wide, as if she didn't quite comprehend what had just happened. Julia shook her head. Oh, that man. He angers me more than just about anyone I've ever met. I'm thrilled I won't be working for him any longer. She sighed. Let's go tell Tom. She watched Anna's face as she made the suggestion, knowing the other woman was intimidated by her husband. She just wished she wasn't so worried about Tom's feelings about Anna. She did know without a doubt that if Tom had feelings for Anna, they were not reciprocated. Anna wrinkled her nose. Do we have to? Julia laughed softly, looping her arm through Anna's. We do need to be certain Tom doesn't have any more plans for the evening so we can get him to bring us into town. I'm glad we did the laundry yesterday, so you won't have to worry about it for a bit while you're living with the Hansons. She didn't want to think about what life would be like living under the Hansons' roof. She did not envy her friend one bit. Anna was obviously thinking along the same lines. I can't imagine what life is going to be like living in that man's house. Well, he has nothing against you, because you're rescuing him. He's angry with me for being a loose woman and marrying. Julia grinned slightly, leaning over to whisper in Anna's ear. I wonder if he tells his wife she's a loose woman for marrying him. She knew she was out of line for even suggesting such a thing, but she couldn't help herself. Anna clapped her hand over her mouth to keep from giggling. Now when I meet the woman, that's all I'm going to think about. What are you doing to me? Julia giggled. Everyone needs a friend who will be a bad influence on them. I guess that's who I'll be for you. They reached Tom, and he looked at their linked arms and grinned. You two look like you're having a good time. Have you been introducing Anna around? He couldn't help but hope that Anna had met the man of her dreams and would be walking with him to the pastor to ask him to marry them immediately. He knew it wasn't at all possible, but he still smiled at the idea. Julia knew immediately that he was asking if she'd introduced the other girl to any prospective husbands. In a way. I introduced her to Mr. Hansen, and she's taking over for me as teacher starting tomorrow. Do you mind driving her into town this evening so she can move to Mr. Hansen's, where she'll live for the rest of the school year? She knew Tom wouldn't mind, but she wasn't willing to take him for granted. He was a good husband to her, and she needed to be certain to always treat him with respect. Tom shook his head. I don't mind at all. He hoped his face didn't show how excited he was at the prospect. He was ready to get rid of the girl. She wasn't at all how he'd pictured her. Julia smiled. That settles it then. We'll all drive in together this evening. She knew that Anna wouldn't want to be alone with Tom for the drive into town. She was too nervous around him. She immediately started thinking about what she'd fix for supper to make it easier on the others. When Anna came down the stairs after supper that evening, carrying her carpet bags, she hugged Julia tightly. I've never had a friend like you. I'm so glad I'm staying in the area so we can get to know one another better. I feel the same way. I've spent my whole life studying all the time so that I could become a good teacher. I've never really had time to make friends. I'm so glad we've gotten to know each other and that we can be friends. Our circumstances are odd. She knew that was an understatement, but she wasn't certain how else to say it. The other woman had been wonderful to her, and she was certain she wouldn't have been as sweet-tempered and forgiving if the situation had been reversed. Anna laughed. That's putting it mildly. I never thought I would meet the woman who married my fiancé and actually like her. Tom came into the house then and picked up Anna's bags. Is this all you brought? He asked. It was the same amount that Julia had come with, but for some reason, he was surprised Anna had brought so little. He saw Anna as someone who was much more vain about her appearance than Julia, although he'd seen nothing that would make him feel that way. Anna nodded, her face suddenly shy and serious. Yes. Tom turned away so she wouldn't see the exasperation on his face. If he'd married her, he would have strangled her within a week. She just made him crazy. He hoped she had a good life, though, as long as it wasn't as his bride. On the way into town, Julia sat between Tom and Anna on the buckboard, talking nonstop about the area and what she'd discovered so far. There's a town near here that's said to have healing waters. People drink them and bathe in them, from what I understand. It's called mineral wells. When Anna didn't really respond, she continued. Weatherford seems to be a real hub of activity around here. Did you take the train into Weatherford like I did? She asked. Julia couldn't help but wish one of the other two would say something, anything, to contribute to the conversation, but while they both talked to her constantly, they seemed to have nothing to say to one another. The Hansons' house was big, and they were obviously people of wealth. When Tom pulled up, Anna frowned around Julia, who sat between her and Tom. Are you certain this is the right place? It's so big. The look on her face made it plain she was intimidated by the huge house. Tom nodded. Yes, Mr. Hanson is the richest man in town. He got down and helped Anna down and got her bags from the back. He looked at Julia. Are you getting down? He knew she wasn't fond of Mr. Hanson, but he wanted to at least make certain she knew she could come if she wanted to. Julia shook her head. I'm not going anywhere near that judgmental man. She folded her arms across her chest and looked out over the street, waiting for the others to return. She'd wait in the wagon for 3 hours rather than go with them into Mr. Hanson's house. Tom was startled to hear Anna's indrawn breath, and he looked at her worriedly. He was surprised to see that she was laughing with her hand covering her mouth to keep from guffawing in the street. You find Julia's attitude toward Mr. Hanson amusing? He asked. It was the most emotion he'd seen from the woman, and he was astonished that she was that amused over his wife's utter disgust with the head of the school board. She simply nodded, not meeting his eyes. She turned to walk up the stone walkway to the front door and knocked. An older woman, probably in her mid-50s, with gray hair and tired-looking blue eyes, answered the door. I'm Anna Simmons. The door was opened wide. I'm Dorothy Hanson. Welcome. She eyed Tom. Just give Miss Simmons her bags. While a single lady is living in this house, there will be no men allowed. Tom nodded and set the bags down, turning back to the wagon. He wasn't going to argue with the old biddy. He was too happy to be going home with his wife, where there were no guests, and where she wouldn't have to rush to get ready for bed because she had to teach in the morning. He climbed onto the seat beside Julia and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. I'm glad that it's going to be just us again. His bite on her ear left her in no doubt about what he was planning for their evening alone together. Julia nodded. I am too. I'm really glad Anna accepted the position. I hope she enjoys it more than I did. Working for Mr. Hanson made me just a little bit crazy. She'd never met anyone like the man, and she honestly hoped she never did again. She would have liked to ask Tom to switch churches, but she knew that she could avoid Mr. Hanson if she needed to, and she wanted to see Anna regularly. Both of the Hansons are judgmental bigots. I almost feel sorry for Anna having to live with them. Of course, I don't feel sorry enough for her to ask her to live with us. They'd reached the edge of town, and he leaned down and nipped at her neck. I'm too happy with my new wife to care too much about her. He wanted to pull her into the wagon bed with him right there and then, but he knew she would protest. He'd have to wait until they arrived home, and he could. Just barely. Julia sighed contentedly, leaning against him. I was really worried that when you saw her, you were going to realize that you'd made a mistake by marrying me and want her instead. She hadn't spoken the words aloud to him before that, choosing instead to worry in silence. Now that the other woman was gone, she felt free to express her worries. Tom laughed. She's afraid of her own shadow. She would have driven me crazy in less than a week. I need a fiery redhead who's not afraid to speak her mind and call her employer judgmental. He couldn't have found a woman more perfect for him even if he'd known what he was looking for to ask for it specifically. Well, that's certainly what you've got with me. She said nothing else as they drove home, content that he didn't want Anna once and for all. She certainly wanted to see her friend find happiness, but she knew she could survive for the rest of the school year with the Hansons. She'd keep her eyes peeled and find the best possible husband for Anna, even though Anna didn't feel like she could marry. She needed to find a man who was just as shy as Anna was. It may not be an easy job, but she knew she could do it. Chapter 7. They'd been married about a month when Julia received a letter from her parents. She waited until Tom went back to work after unloading their purchases from their trip into town before she sat down to read it. She was very nervous about what they'd have to say. She hoped they wouldn't judge her too harshly. Dear Julia, we're thrilled to hear about your marriage to Tom. He sounds like a really good man. I think you misunderstood our intentions all along. We wanted you to teach, but only so you would have a way out of New York and not be forced to spend your life working in factories as we have. We both wish you the best, knowing that you'll be happy and not forced to come back here again. Hopefully we'll be able to make a trip out to see you someday, but even if we don't, please know that you have all our love. Please write. I'm ready to hear that I have a grandchild on the way. All our love, Mama and Papa. Julia let out a breath, feeling tension she didn't know she'd been holding inside leave her body. She'd been so worried her parents would be angry with her about her decision to marry and not teach, that she'd been almost afraid to write to them and tell them what she'd done. She carefully folded the letter and put it into the pocket of her apron and started supper, knowing she would cook a good celebratory meal that evening. Tom had just sold several of his cattle, and they had some extra money, so she'd splurged a bit on fabrics to make some cushions for the chairs and curtains. She wanted to make her house a special home. When Tom came in for supper, she served the meal and sat down across from him, bowing her head automatically for his prayer. As he was putting the food onto his plate, he asked, "What did your mother have to say?" He was surprised she hadn't already offered the information. Julia was astonished to feel tears sting her eyes as she answered. She's thrilled that I'm married. It wasn't so much that she wanted me to teach as that she wanted me to get out of New York and not spending the rest of my life working in a factory like she did. She sighed happily. They're being so much more positive about it than I thought they would be. The excitement she felt at having their blessing showed clearly on her face. Tom smiled, loving how happy she was. Does that mean you feel better about everything, and you're not worried anymore? He asked. She nodded. It does. I'm sorry it's been on my mind so much, but I couldn't help but worry. I mean, I'm thrilled to have you as a husband, and I'm very happy, but it was always in the back of my mind that my parents would be angry when they found out. Knowing they're pleased has made the difference for me. Well, I hope you know, I don't care if they're happy or not, I'm not letting you go. I love you too much to give you up now. He said the words nonchalantly, as if he told her he loved her every day. She stared at him in surprise for a moment. You love me? You didn't just settle for me because I was the one who got off the stagecoach? Always in the back of her mind was the thought that if Anna had gotten off the stage, He would have taken one look at her and wanted to stay with her forever. She was glad it had been her, but she couldn't feel like it should have been. He chuckled. Of course, I didn't. You can't believe that. Didn't he show her in little ways every day how much he loved her? Was she blind? She shook her head. I was never sure. I mean, I know I love you, but I keep expecting you to realize that Anna was the girl you really wanted. She's so tiny and pretty, and I'm just me. She felt like she was a giant next to the tiny girl. You really didn't need to worry about that. I saw you and knew you were the only woman I would ever want in my life. Even he had been astonished by how quickly he'd fallen for the pretty redhead. But you were in love with Anna. How could his feelings have changed so quickly? Would they change again? Tom frowned. I sent 2 letters to her, and she received one from me. That's the only communication we ever had with one another. I wasn't in love with her. I was excited about having a bride, but you ended up being that bride for me, not her. He shuddered to think what life would have been like if he'd married Anna and not Julia. He may have grown to be content, but he never would have been truly happy like he was with Julia. Really? I thought you'd been writing longer, I guess. It never occurred to me that she was as much of a stranger to you as I was. She looked down at her hands, worried for a moment. You really don't mind that you married me and not her? Despite his words, she had to ask one more time to be certain. He shook his head adamantly. Of course, I don't mind. I saw you and fell in love. I saw her and was annoyed almost instantly by the way she wouldn't meet my eyes. She said she was shy, and I thought I could handle that, but she'd have driven me crazy. He wasn't exactly certain why she annoyed him so much, but she was the absolute opposite of Julia in so many ways. It wouldn't have worked out between them, and he knew it. Julia frowned. I guess that just goes to show you how differently men and women see things. I saw her and thought that she would be any man's ideal woman. She's tiny, pretty, and soft-spoken. She must be crazy listing the other woman's good qualities, but she had to make certain he realized that she was good wife material. He laughed. She's so short I would get a crick in my neck when I kissed her. I prefer your looks. Your hair looks like it's about to catch fire to me, and I think that's beautiful. And she's so soft-spoken that I can't hear anything she says. She won't look at me when she talks, and that's very annoying. He spoke of the things that had made him realize that she wasn't the woman for him, while making certain that each thing made Julia feel more beautiful. Julia just shook her head. We need to find her a good man to marry. One who won't mind her shyness. She was positively excited at the idea of finding a good husband for her friend. Tom rolled his eyes at her, laughing. Are you going to start playing matchmaker? Julia shrugged. I just might. I like the idea of providing her with a husband since I feel like I stole hers. She was, and always would be, full of remorse for her part in ruining Anna's life. Tom walked around the table and took her hand, pulling her to her feet. You didn't, you know. I'd have married her, but I never would have belonged to her heart and soul like I belong to you. I love you, Julia. You were the woman God created just for me, and I can't imagine spending my life with anyone else. What more could he say to make her realize she was perfect in his eyes? Julia sighed, resting her head on his shoulder. I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone. She kissed his chin. I'm glad you were the one to pick me up from the stagecoach. I wouldn't change a moment of our lives together. Tom closed his eyes and rested his cheek atop her head. I wouldn't either. I'm so glad you said that. I've been feeling guilty about forcing you into marriage from the moment I realized that you weren't the woman I thought you were. I never wanted to go back and marry Anna, but I felt guilty for being so determined to keep you. Julia grinned. No more guilt is necessary. I love you, and I am so glad we got married." She looked down at the dishes on the table for a moment and decided to ignore them. Instead, she pulled him toward the bedroom and shut the door, shutting out the whole world. She was right where she needed to be, in the arms of the man she loved. Epilogue. Anna sat on her bed in the Hansons' house and wrote a quick letter to Elizabeth Miller, the owner of the mail-order bride agency who had placed her with Tom. "Dear Elizabeth, you asked me to write to you when I was married and settled to let you know I was all right. I'm not married, but I do appear to be settled. When I arrived, 2 weeks late as you know, Tom had accidentally married another woman. I can't make myself be angry, because you look at the two of them, and you can see the love that radiates off them, both as they look at one another. Tom seemed so sweet in his letters, but I can't see myself married to him. We really don't belong together. I'm not certain what I'm going to do from here, but I have no desire to try to be a mail-order bride again at this time. I'm going to teach at least until the end of the school year and see what happens from there. According to Julia, the woman I should hate but find I'm extremely fond of, there are a great deal of unmarried men around here just looking for wives. I may teach for a year and then look for a husband, or I may just continue teaching. I don't know. But I'm here and settled for now, so you no longer need to worry about me. If I decide to be a mail-order bride again, I will write to you and let you know. I honestly don't see that happening though. My life would have been miserable married to Tom. Thank you for all the help you gave me. I'm glad to be out of Beckham, and I've made a very good friend. She's probably the best friend I've ever had. She's here and has promised to do her best to look out for me. I will continue to write if you wish it, but please don't worry. Sincerely, Anna." She folded the letter to mail on her way to school the following morning. After 3 weeks of teaching at the Wiggyville school, she knew exactly what to expect, all except for the new boy, of course. He'd been in town for less than a week, and he was a troublemaker like she'd never seen. His mother had died somewhere back east, so she'd sent a letter to his father to come see her at the school. She was not looking forward to meeting the man and talking to him about his son's behavioral issues. The boy was a hellion, and she didn't know what else she was going to be able to say about him. Asterisk. As soon as school was dismissed Monday afternoon, Anna stood to wipe the blackboard clean and write out the assignments for Tuesday. She was exhausted. Ernie Hoover, her new student, had caused as much havoc in the school as he possibly could. He'd come in late, blocked the outhouse door with one of the other young boys inside, refused to study, and basically just made her day as difficult as he could. She heard footsteps behind her and she turned around, looking to see who was there. A man of medium height and build, with dark hair and brown eyes the color of chocolate, stood at the back of the school with his hand clamped firmly on Ernie's shoulder. So this was his father. She walked toward the back of the room, swallowing hard, because she always had a hard time talking to men, and she was certain this man would be no exception. Once she reached the back of the room, she looked down at Ernie, who was squirming under his father's hand. "Go on out to the schoolyard, Ernie. I need to speak with your father privately." Ernie looked at his father, and stuck his tongue out at Anna before running from the room. Anna waited for Mr. Hoover to say something to correct the boy, but when he didn't she all but growled. "Do you always let him get away with disrespectful behavior, Mr. Hoover?" Mr. Hoover raised an eyebrow before sticking his thumbs through the belt loops of his work pants and looking her up and down. "Do you always let your students treat you disrespectfully and expect their parents to fix the problem? I assure you, Miss Simmons, I don't have time to sit in your classroom all day and do your job." Anna saw red. She'd never been so angry at a man in her entire life. Normally, she would be afraid to react to the criticism, but she was furious. She took a step toward him, her tiny stature still having to look way up to him, despite him not being taller than average. "If you were doing your job and raising the boy right in the first place, He wouldn't dare to think of being disrespectful in my classroom. Who do you think you are telling me I'm not raising my boy right? He took one more step forward, and the two of them were all but brushing their bodies up against one another as they faced each other. Are you telling me that you don't think you should have to teach your boy to behave correctly in the first place, and it's my job to both parent and teach him? As soon as the words were out of her mouth, she knew she'd gone too far, but she couldn't take them back. She bit her lip, waiting to see what the man would say or do. Jesse Hoover's eyes flashed as he stared down at the tiny little spitfire of a teacher. He knew Ernie was trouble. He had been ever since his mother had died, but it wasn't Jesse's job to deal with him while Ernie was at school. He was only 8. What kind of teacher couldn't deal with an 8-year-old boy? Don't you have a ruler you can use on his knuckles? Anna's eyes grew even wider. If he was disciplined properly at home, I wouldn't have to resort to corporal punishment in my classroom. If I have to get the ruler out, then I will have to disrupt the entire class to use it. If you will just discipline him at home and make it clear that you will back up whatever I say, then we won't have any more issues. Jesse was so angry, he wanted to hit the woman. He stared down into her pretty face and realized hitting her wasn't what he wanted to do. He wanted to kiss her. He grabbed her by the waist and pulled her to him, his mouth crushing hers with a hard kiss, his tongue immediately demanding entrance. Anna stood paralyzed for a moment, not believing this man was actually touching her. Didn't he know she was his son's teacher? It only took a moment for her to feel her stomach fill with longing. She put her hands up to his shoulders to push him away, and instead, she grasped them and clung to him. Her mind was no longer functioning. What was he doing to her? After a moment, Jesse lifted his head, staring down at the pretty little teacher. Her hair was coming down from the sides of her bun, where it had been pinned up severely. Her lips, a bright pink and moist from his kiss, were still parted, and she was panting slightly. She was a teacher? She looked like she should be a dancer in the local saloon. Not her clothes, of course, but the wanton look on her face. He stared at her for a moment, waiting for her to open her eyes and realize exactly what she was doing. Anna blinked a few times, returning to reality. Instead of agreeing to discipline his child properly, he had kissed her instead. She had never been kissed before, and the first time it was by a man whose first name she didn't even know. What was wrong with her? She took a step back, just as she saw the pink fabric of the skirt of a dress disappear around the corner. Oh blast! Someone just saw that. I'm going to lose my job. She folded her arms across her chest for a moment, glaring at him. Jesse's eyes widened. Her stance was all but demanding to know what he was going to do about her impending job loss. I guess you shouldn't be going around kissing your students' fathers instead of working then, should you? Anna clenched her fists, not believing this man would really say that to her. I trust that you'll talk to Ernie and get his behavior under control so that I don't have to expel him. Good day, Mr. Hoover. She turned and walked regally to her desk on the raised platform at the front of the room and sank into her chair. She watched as he stared at her for a moment before shaking his head and walking from the room. She was a little snob, and he wasn't going to deal with her any longer. His son was fine. He was just a boy. That woman was just going to have to learn how to deal with boys. Once in the schoolyard, he grabbed Ernie's hand and started toward home. Just as he left the schoolyard, he heard himself say, "When we get home, I'm going to take a belt to your bottom like I should have done years ago, boy. You will not show that kind of disrespect to anyone, but most especially your teacher." He had no clue where the words had come from, but once they were out, he almost smiled. Yes, Ernie needed to be taken in hand. He'd never tell that little spitfire of a teacher he agreed with her, though. No way.